to this first episode of Effective Altruism, from Effective Altruism to Pragmatic Utopianism in a Second Renaissance. I'm Rufus Pollock from Life Itself. I'm collaborating. Max, do you want to say a little bit about yourself quickly?
Yeah, hi Rufus. I've been running this red teaming fellowship through Effective Altruism Oxford, where the EA movement was founded. And the whole premise of this fellowship is that we can constructively criticize EA and try to reform it from within. So my interests align quite nicely with the framing that Rufus introduced.
To start by, in a way, steel manning or steel personing effective altruism as an approach. And I also want to kind of flag at the beginning this kind of effective altruism as a philosophy, as a kind of intellectual stance, and there's obviously the community and the movement. And those things aren't always identical, like in the sense that many people can join the community who might not fully subscribe to the philosophy. They might just be like really sympathetic with the idea of just doing good better, as the slogan goes for effective altruism, which is a really admirable, end. We want doing good is pretty amazing, and doing it better with more reflection, more rationality, more wisdom, even, is a really, wonderful ambition, and certainly what has interested and inspired me. I like to say, well, I've not. I would say that I've never. I was an effective altruist before its time. So yeah, I don't know if that point of like just starting out, like what's great about effective altruism, and also kind of steel manning the philosophy would be a good place to start. What do you think, Max?
Yeah, so I think the kind of textbook definition of effective altruism is quite like informative, and then revealing about its limitations. So conventionally, EA is defined as using reason and evidence to do the most good. Now, just immediately, so there's a methodological component and an epistemic component that they're saying we could reason and evidence are the tools by which we can do the most good. And then the second part is like the moral or like normative component. And it's a to characterize it, it's a maximalist like ethic. So they're not just saying we should do some good or like do good in our own lives. They have this very ambitious goal of doing the most good that it's possible to do. Um, uh, Related to this, there's this less wrong concept of world optimization. So you could frame effective altruism as like a world optimization movement. Another term that's used by this EA philosopher, Richard Chappell, is he refers to EA as a beneficentrist movement. So they care about welfare. So they're trying to maximize welfare. And so this also reveals how EA has been very influenced by economics. So yeah, that's a start.
Yeah, I mean, so I want to say a couple of things. I was an effective altruist in many ways before its time. Um, so in the early 2000s, why I chose to study economics was because I wanted to do good and do kind of the most good. And I was, I saw economics, which has many connections, I think, at least in philosophically, with effective altruism. There's utilitarianism, this idea of welfare, maximizing utility, and then also the aspect of using kind of reason empirics, having a structured way of evaluating how to do good, was very appealing to me. And so I have a lot of sympathy with that view, even though I'll kind of come to why I kind of, for myself, at least as an economist, started to see the limits of that. But I also want to say what I really admire about EA is that, like, just first of all, so one is that doing good, like lots of people in this world are not that interested in doing good. And within the EA community, that's like a major focus, like it's a major, like people are really dedicating their lives, their jobs they do, giving significant amounts of money, and really like just oriented around philanthropy or contributing, being an altruist. And that's like really amazing. And it's not necessarily that common in our society. So first of all, I think that's amazing. Secondly, I think the reason orientation and the empirics orientation is also great. Like there are many people who admirably are doing good, but they're like, oh, my niece had blood cancer as a kid. That's terrible. I'll give my money to, pediatric cancer ward, even though, however terrible pediatric cancer is, it may be only affect a very few people relative to, I don't know, malaria. So I think this aspect of thinking about how we can do at least more good, maybe not the most good, but certainly more good, is really great. And using reason empirics is neglected. I think is really, really great. And it brings me to the third thing, which I think is, for me, almost the most admirable thing about effective altruism and particularly its community, which is that the best version of using reason, the best version of empiricism takes you to a kind of towards what I would call Socratic wisdom, where you're really saying, I really want to inquire deeply into the world. And in particular, I'm going to have epistemic humility. I'm going to question my beliefs. I'm going to be curious. I'm going to be open-minded. I am going to really look at my assumptions, and I'm going to be curious. I'm interested in learning more about things, in changing my views. And at the deepest level, that also involves quite deep, in a way, ontological work, inner work, in the sense that I have to deal with my ego. I want to be right. And epistemic humility requires that I'm open to changing my mind, to being wrong, to learning. And particularly when you have that as a systemic belief and behavior within a community, like a desire to inquire into our blind spots, to see where we deceive ourselves, to look at how we can be more reasonable and more rational in a really quite deep sense of that, not in the kind of legalistic sense of argument and disputation, but in a really real way. And it shows up in a collective. You have something really powerful. You have people who are kind of bathing in that culturally. And I think that if it's realized, which I think I've seen in my encounters with quite a few people in the effective altruism community, is being realized, is really incredible. And the fact, to end, that you're doing a red teaming fellowship or running a red teaming fellowship, that there's this encouragement of critique and examination and questioning, is a symbol of that. Like it's an institutional representation of this attitude of inquiry, open-mindedness, and self-critique that's really, really, really admirable. Even if, as we might discuss, there are some limitations to that, or ways that it could be even better improved, maybe is the better way I'd look at it. So I just really want to say that up front. I just think the effective altruist community in many ways is amazing. And I feel that I was an effective altruist, even if I've sort of had some ways seen some evolution beyond that.
Yeah, so I think it's really pivotal to draw a distinction between effective altruism in principle and effective altruism in practice, or what you might call actually existing effective altruism. So pragmatic utopianism is a form of effective altruism. So it shares this same goal of doing the most good. So it's value aligned in that.
Yes.
But it might be like means misaligned, right? So
yes,
we disagree on exactly how to do the most good. And so one part of that is if the EA methodology is to use reason and evidence, the PU methodology might be like described as post-rationalist.
yes, or trans-rationalist, even better. Yeah,
yes,
it includes rationalism, but doesn't limit itself to it.
Yeah, and also trying to account for the fact that for certain things we can't gather sufficient evidence like to make it like an evidential case for. So like long term civilizational change, you can't do a randomized controlled trial to assess
Yes.
the efficacy of. So yeah, so um this is the dialectic, like
So wait, just a second, just before we get to that, because I think you're on a great thing. Can I ask, could we just take a moment, because you're very knowledgeable? Let's just dig a bit more. Imagine we were talking to listeners who were less knowledgeable about effective altruism, and or just speaking to people who were like, can we say a bit more about what effective altruism is philosophically, and a bit more about like utilitarianism, a bit more about the empirical bent and the reason bent, and then maybe even some kind of concrete areas that effective altruism ends up focusing on, and the approach they take to it. So people, we and you and I have a flavor, and also in as a steel-manned a way as possible of what that looks like. What do you think of doing that first before we then describe pragmatic utopianism and what?
yeah. I think we may as well clarify our terms. I mean, that's a very like philosophical way of approaching it. Um, so yeah, yeah. I suppose like what more do we want to say on like what effective altruism is? Like,
Well, I think normally a way that works for most people is to pick a kind of concrete examples of what it means. So, does effective altruism end up cashing out as in terms of what they focus on as issues, how they approach those issues, etc.
yeah. Okay, so like one of the first effective altruism cause areas was global poverty, health, and development. Um, and so this was a response to like aid programs, um, overseas development budgets, and like non-profits that were doing charitable work, like in Africa, for instance. Um, and the effective altruist came in and said that a lot of these resources are being like misallocated and like used ineffectively. Um, and so in the early days within this cause area, they one of their interventions was to use the randomized control trial. This was like kind of it's the gold standard in like medical research, and so they were applying it in like a broader like sociological and ethical context. Um, so yeah,
And just to emphasize a point here, this is another example of the synergy with economics, and then that was being done by like Esther Duflo and other people in economics before EA arrived, but it hadn't really penetrated that much yet. Maybe into it was early days. Like I was reading papers in the early 2000s where you start to do randomized controlled trials around aid type work in Africa, but that hadn't penetrated that widely into you know overseas development, other things yet. But it's an
yeah,
example where that was kind of the EA effective altruism really took up that kind of work. I don't know if you're like Esther Duflo was doing these RCTs. She set up a center at MIT for doing RCTs around aid and so on, and wrote books about like poor economics and stuff like that.
yeah. So there is this precursor in development economics. Yeah, and I think the reason why it then became more major with EA is because you had like philosophers like Peter Singer, who was quite influential and well known, kind of getting tied with like Bill Gates. Um, and so there was a clear kind of pathway from like the thought leaders to like the elite decision makers. Um, and also, like the movement was founded at Oxford, which has kind of like brand value globally. And so it's kind of provocative that there are these like young Oxford philosophers that are kind of criticizing like how governments and major charities are like using their money. Um, yeah. So yeah. So that was the kind of one of the early approaches to global poverty. After this, there was like one of the most upvoted forum posts. It won like the Decade Review. Was something like it was comparing what they termed random Easter development with growth based development. So it was saying instead of doing these very narrow interventions like bed nets for malaria or like educational materials, we can just broadly try and enhance the rate of economic growth, and that will have like these spillover like multiplier effect.
Outs outsized effect. This is classic economics again, right? This is a massive debate in economics.
Yeah.
Like just focus on growth. Just that was Bill Gates' philosophy from the 90s, was just like, do some development work, but also just drive growth. That's what's going to really make the difference. This is classic even right wing classical economics here.
Yes, yeah. So that is broadly how effective altruism is approaching global poverty, health, and development through this random Easter development and this growth maximalist approach. Yeah, there's even been a spin-off of effective altruism progress studies, and thinkers like Tyler Cohen, Jason Crawford, Steven Pinker, Will McCaskill's new book on What We Owe the Future, they all advocate for maximizing growth as like the strategy to like improving welfare. And particularly this relates to their long-termist orientation that growth compounds over time. And so in the space of 100 years, if you've got sustained growth, like you're just doing orders of magnitude more good than if you stagnated. So I think that's some useful context.
And what we just want to say there, just to pull out, because obviously there are many critiques of that. One of which is this like growth. Many people out there who are into who are concerned about the ecological crisis, is that material growth at least is, beyond a certain point, may not actually bring that much well-being, but certainly use up the planet's resources. But I just want to say, like, the classic, assumption there, which is built in, is that because we're here mainly talking about material growth, like growth in like how many cars we have, how many houses, things we measure in GDP, how much cement we produce. These things are there's a kind of materialist orientation and this is classic economics GDP. And so all of the critiques you'd have of that show up here. But just to say that there is a kind of cargo culting aspect, which is, you could see EA as a very interesting movement in that it's taking really economics, kind of quite old economics in a way, but maybe combined with modern data. We haven't been able to do RCTs in development that much until like the 80s and 90s. Just, you needed computers, you needed like better data collection in the field. You could do basic stuff before that, but it really took off 80s, 90s, and 2000s. But basically, these are quite old ideas, but which are suddenly becoming a mass, or at least a mini mass movement in like, Oxford undergraduates are like, I'm going to go and do the best good, but they're doing it within an ideology and a framework which is basically neoliberal economics to some extent, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, so like one framing I have of what effective altruism is that it's an alignment technology for capitalism. So it's the ultimate form of system justification, that it just so happens that the imperatives of capitalism, which is infinite growth, also happens to map perfectly onto like the optimal strategy for doing the most good. Like it's a really suspicious convergence.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And yeah, yes, it is. And this is a point that, I mean, but let's come back to it. So there's kind of this, but it's just really interesting that many of the arguments that showed up in kind of basically neoliberal economics, has become mainstream economics, just happen to be like, maximizing growth is the basic argument of, mainstream economics, despite there being critiques from other, the Marxist economic school and other heterodox economic schools. And, and that even deeper critiques like what, Amartya Sen, like capabilities, like other frameworks that would look at like human welfare and well-being as not just being basically how much resource we have. Even though traditional economics doesn't just see the resource because, I can eat more hamburgers, it's like that empowers me in other ways. Basically, it comes down to material stuff. So What are the other cause areas then that that started coming up? I mean, and particularly there was a kind of convergence with the rationalist community, which we might need to say a little bit about,
Yeah, I feel like we haven't quite tied a
because the
bow on.
rationalist community is a bit distinct for them.
Yeah, sorry, you broke up for a minute, so
So do you want to say a bit more about that and like what other cause areas started to rise? Yeah, yeah, you go ahead.
yeah, so I was just gonna say in relation to the like GDP point that like we want to be careful not to like misrepresent effective altruism here. So it seems like
Yes,
they have an awareness that GDP as a measure of human value is limited. So there is like Goodhart's law, like that when a proxy becomes the target of optimization, the proxy will cease to be a good proxy. And so they have this awareness. It's like a core kind of epistemic principle of EA. It's related to the idea that the map is not the territory. So you could look at like GDP metrics going up, and that's just correlated with welfare improvements. So you don't want to reduce welfare to GDP.
yes, yeah, no,
Um,
totally. I got that.
yeah.
There's nuance. There's quite a bit of nuance there. I wasn't saying that, but I was saying that the basic point of like growth is good, growth is the way, particularly what we'd call material growth. Maybe like I'm going to say, um, that's becomes quite central, is what I'm understanding from what you're saying.
Like I think the main critique of this is just negative externalities. So like welfare is a positive externality of growth, and like climate change and other catastrophic risks like from AI, which will segue to I think what you were steering the conversation towards. These are like the ultimate negative externalities. So techno-capitalism has been like accelerating growth for like a century, and it's now being able to leverage that capital towards developing massive training runs for like the most advanced AI systems. And so like a very important kind of frame is to like look at this process of techno capital over time, and to really account systematically for its negative and positive externalities. And what gets lost in the EA and progress studies growth narrative is the negative externalities. And so it's also quite convenient that like Steven Pinker, for instance, will dismiss like AI risk as like just a kind of fantasy, like from science fiction. To fit the narrative that we can keep going, and that this trajectory is ultimately positive. Yeah, I think we can wrap that kind of analysis of global poverty up and move on to the other cause areas.
Yeah. So what are other cause areas? And I was going to, what I mentioned, maybe it was slightly lost. There's this kind of connection with the rationalist community, which is not identical with EA, but it's certainly extremely, there's quite a significant overlap and quite a lot of connection ideologically and philosophically, and that's relationship with existential risk and particularly AI risk. Do you want to say a bit about that, both kind of historically in a way and philosophically?
Yeah, so uh, there's been some kind of comments that EA has gone through a few waves, and its current wave is broadly long-termist, so they care about the long-term future and the immense value that it could hold because people could live longer, there could be much more people, and like their quality of life could be much higher than it is now. So there's this sense that most of the value will exist over long-term time horizons.
And so, and just to say this, just to say it again, for if we were listeners, is to make a really crucial point that once you're a utilitarian, so people who may not know utilitarians, kind of things that make up utilitarianism. First of all, some kind of belief that we can measure well-being of people, and often in a relatively that we can often use material proxies for that well-being, even though we know that's not exactly true. There's some degree of that, and more importantly, that we can kind of sum up utility. So we can just the utility of a society or the welfare of society is the summation of its members. And this is what you do a lot in economics, to create a welfare function for your analysis of society, you basically add up all the utilities of all the individuals. Now, you also have assumptions like that utility, there's declining marginal utility. So as people get wealthier, an extra dollar makes less difference to them and so on. but essentially people are equivalent and you add them up. And this has implications. Like if you do that over time, and for example, there's 10 billion people today, but let's say there were 100 billion people in 5,000 years. The utility of that 100 billion people, obviously a small increment in their utility kind of dwarfs utility today, depending on how you do discounting and things like that. So a lot of things that you'll get, like attitudes towards long-termism, which could come out of many concerns, like just being a good ancestor, like what we owe the future in some virtue sense, but also tends to come out of like ideas of like adding up utility or well-being in the future. So there's this kind of like the measurement utilitarian economic basis behind some of this, as well as maybe the broader philosophical concern of just being responsible towards the future. So I just wanted to, I don't know, I interrupted, but just kind of emphasize that.
What it prompted me to say is that the logic behind global poverty as a cause area like naturally extends to catastrophic risk and long-termism, because like one of the thought experiments was Singer's Pond, which is about spatial impartiality. So it was trying to get at there's a child drowning in a pond and you come by and like you should rescue that child, and it's this analog for the fact that there are children starving all around the world right now that are in like similar pond-like scenarios, and the only reason we don't leap to save them is because they're not within our proximity. So if what long-termism is doing is extending this like geographical and spatial impartiality to time. So there's a temporal dimension. So now we don't just care about people that are like alive now, but about future generations.
Yes.
And so this is part of the utilitarian worldview, that you take a God's eye perspective. So again, it's quite theological.
Well, famously, if I can make one
God is
comment,
outside of time, right?
I just say, like, I don't know if you know, there's this famous, well, in economic circles, quite famous debate of Frank Ramsey and Keynes. So Ramsey is this brilliant like undergraduate who ends up doing kind of economics to some extent and dies very young in the 1930s, where he's in the first kind of models where they do discounting. You try and do economics where you do like generational stuff, which is quite common in economics. But you have this question of like, do I do discounting? Like, which is the aspect that the value of your welfare in the future or utility in the future is not the same as today. You'd have to offer me 10 ice creams in a year to give up one ice cream today, kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Ramsey had this famous like moral point where they were defending ethics, where it's like, how can you justify any kind of discount rate, like between generations? In the 1930s, early 30s, they had this debate of like, there should be a zero discount rate because we should care about the future as much as today. And this kind of moral and ethical question of like, why is the future less valuable today, or should it be equally valuable, was hotly debated in quite a deep moral way in early economics.
Yeah. So I think like the clear reason why you do discounting is because the future's uncertain. So like if someone
Yes,
do an ice cream now, you know that you can get it. Whereas
yes, that's the probabilistic one. But
yes,
let's say it's certain. Even then, even if I know that I would be, let's say there's very short time scales, people still seem to do discounting. Normal humans still seem to be like, well, the value of something in 3 days' time when I'm almost certainly alive is less than today. But I get your point. One option is the probabilistic certainty of I actually get it, and the other is actual time preference, actual differences in value between something now and in the future.
yeah, and this might be where your like Buddhism comes in, that people can't delay gratification and have desires that they need to be satisfied, and so this is a pressure that makes people discount.
Yes.
Like
But
if
the
you had
key point is morally why there's no real justification. Ramsey's point,
yes,
which is the same as Singer's, just about spatial and about time, is a person 1,000 years from now, why are they not morally equally valuable? There might be some uncertainty they exist, that there's a probabilistic point, but as at least in a basic sense, they're equally meriting our concern and care as someone around today. Just as a
yeah.
child in Africa is just as important if I'm in England as a child in the city next to me. But we don't act like that.
Yes, yeah. So that is one of the critical interventions of like this total utilitarian long-termist view.
So what you were saying about the waves, so just tell me, so the first wave was like global poverty, kind of growth, and so on. What was the second wave then?
Let me just get
Look,
the forum post up so I'm getting this right. Yeah. Yeah, so the second wave was long-termism. And the third wave it has been left open. So possibly it's pragmatic utopianism and post-rationalism. Yeah, although
yes.
now it seems to be very clearly AI safety. Like that's the
Yeah.
third wave. Um,
So
so
talk about that kind of existential risk. When did that come into the effective altruism movement, and what's the philosophical kind of connection?
yeah, so the concern, so Nick Bostrom coined the term existential risk, I think in 2002, which happens to coincide with the year I was born. So that's what a tragedy. But yeah, so the motivation for Bostrom was quite techno-utopian. He had this idea of astronomical waste, um, that basically, if there was like an existential catastrophic event, then the entire value of the long-term future would be lost. And then also, another part of astronomical waste is that if we don't accelerate technological and economic development as fast as possible, then that value of the future will be realized at a later date than it could have been. And so we want to minimize like that time window. Um, this also weaves with his like post-humanist leaning. So he founded the World like Transhumanist Society that's now called Humanity Plus. And so his logic is that like the universe is entropic and the stars are burning out, and all of that is energy that we could use to power digital mind servers and run these like paradise simulations. And so the longer it takes for us to develop this technology and like build Dyson spheres, the more energy is lost, and then the less utility is generated.
And this is just to say, uh, well, I mean, we could cover this more, but these are the kind of things. Again, if you're a listener or thinking about this, one of the things obviously noted in economics and economists are aware of, and utilitarian philosophers were aware of, and it's shown up again. You know, there's a tendency where I say EA is like mass economics, like it's like mass utilitarianism. Um, there are certain paradoxes that come up. I mean, in EA, it starts to be called Pascal's mugging, but there's this problem that economists knew about for a while is that once you have utilitarianism, obviously, and you're summing up like things. It's like why you need discounting, by the way, if you're doing economics generally, is if you started doing if you do like integrate, technically it's an integral, but if you sum up welfare of people and you don't discount the future and there's any kind of growth effects, then basically the future is always overwhelming the present in any calculation. What I mean by that is like if there's any kind of growth, there's like 10,000 years from now, there's like very small growth rates, like 1% a year over 10,000 years, compound massively. You know, if I do, I'm not going to do the maths immediately in my head, but I think it's like basically every 70 years, that would be a doubling. So every
Mm.
700 years, that would be like 2 to the 10, that would be 1,000-fold. So, you know, like basically we're kind of talking like billions of times more people or whatever than now. And, you know, well, millions of times, billions of times. And if you then add that up, that just overwhelms any impact in the present. Like, you know, kind of anything you can do to move that needle for the future dwarfs any cost for that for the present. You'd pay any price today to do that, which is Pascal's mugging,
Yeah.
which is
So,
the inverse of Pascal's wager, which is like you should believe in God because, you know, the cost of being wrong, if God exists and you didn't believe in him, you go to hell, but it's not very costly to go to church today, you know, so you should do it. There are, and you know, the rationalist communities, for example, spends a lot of time debating over Pascal's mugging because it is quite a difficult question if you're in that mindset. And in general, actually, it's a difficult question. It isn't actually a trivial question to answer, but it's one that the economics community was very aware of, and other communities have been for quite some time, but shown up again, and leads to these weird, what we at least can feel intuitively like seems weird approaches. Like we just want to upload to digital minds, and we just want to build Dyson spheres, and that's all that really matters. But yeah, to come back, Max, you're doing really well here. Sorry, to keep going. You were saying that this was Bostrom was the kind of the focus on existential risk was because of this huge potential loss if humanity's wiped out or can't even really get out of like an energy sink, like we don't have enough energy to get back to complex civilization and growth, where there's this huge potential future loss. That's what you're saying.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, so like that's the long-termist motivation for reducing existential risk. I think like Bostrom even had this principle called like max-epoch, which was something like maximize the probability that the future goes okay or something like that.
Yeah.
That was like and basically his argument was that like any resources you could use to like reduce suffering in the present that you could allocate to global poverty or animal welfare, like it would be much more valuable to allocate to reducing existential risk, even if it was by a very small percentage.
Yes.
The Pascal's mugging happening.
Pascal's mugging argument. And what's interesting, I do just want to emphasize because it seems like it's always known. Like, for example, I, as an economist in the early 2000s, I was unaware of Bostrom. I'm reading a book by Steve Posner, who's in law and economics, who's a judge actually in the United States, but a famous kind of somewhat right-wing law and economics judge, which is literally going through existential risk and saying why we should spend more money on. Like he goes through asteroids, he goes through, at that point, I'm not sure AI, but goes through a variety of things. And I don't know if you're aware, because it's before you were born, but the late 90s had several asteroid movies. I don't know if you ever watched them. But
like Armageddon.
Armageddon, but there were actually several in one year.
Right.
At that point, which were pointing out these existential risks to humanity. So what I want to emphasize, I think there's two things that happen in effective altruism. One is they took these ideas seriously in a way that other people are like, yes, we should study asteroid risk, and yes, but it wasn't really systematically taken seriously. And the second is that they kind of took it to the max. It's like, I think a lot of people sat there and said, we're aware that there's something a bit irrational about Pascal's mugging, that there's somehow a flaw in it, right? Because it would kind of justify any level of expenditure on avoiding catastrophic risk. But then you face this problem of like, which catastrophic risk? And what is the marginal return exactly on this catastrophic risk versus that one? Or, well, but if I spend everything on that, we might all like live in poverty today. There's something a bit weird about it. But at the same time, there was a kind of willingness to actually act on these ideas and to kind of, like Bostrom, kind of take it to the max, take the just work through the logic and then really take the logic all the way to its extreme and act on it.
Yeah.
So that's what's unusual. Not that the ideas hadn't been around before, in a way.
Yeah. So I think this is like really critical for intellectual progress, that you have certain individuals and theorists that will just take arguments to their like logical conclusion and extremes. And then the next stage of the dialectic is to point out the limitations with that, and you have a kind of reaction where you swing back the other way, and then you find a kind of golden mean. And
yes, the dialectic.
Yes, yeah.
But so just tell me, so you were saying Bostrom in 2002 talked about existential risk. And so tell me a bit about this. Does this influence effective altruism then?
Yeah, so one of the prophets of rationalism is Eliezer Yudkowsky, and he has essentially got a kind of cult following around his like emphasis that AI is the ultimate existential risk, and we need to shut it all down. And a lot of effective altruists have also internalized this, and are like living in fear in many cases, and having therapy to try and cope with the fact that they fear for their own lives and their children's futures. And most of them are also very like compassionate, and so this idea that all sentient minds will uh, could be destroyed is like it's very psychologically overwhelming, and like I resonate with that too. Um, so yeah, it's definitely
But so
like
just in terms of history, around the early 2000s, perhaps because of advances in computer science, there'd already been fantasies from the early 1980s or 70s about the risks. There's Terminator movies, but at least in this community, it got a lot more like logical and like thought through. There's this Eliezer Yudkowsky, there's Bostrom. Bostrom ends up writing Superintelligence in the early 2010s, if I remember. But basically, there's this kind of growth within the effective altruism movement, which starts out in like kind of classic economics, but like starting to really take catastrophic risk and existential risk, risks that could end humanity much more seriously, and particularly this focus on machine intelligence. Is that what you're telling me?
yeah, so I think this is like in part like most normal people when they hear about existential risk, they kind of throw their hands up and say, "Oh, like if the world's gonna end, there's like nothing I can do about it, so I'm just gonna live like a normal life and like take the happiness where I can find it and like just fingers crossed, like hope for the best." Whereas this demographic of rationalists and effective altruists they also have this like self-preservation goal, but then they also have the kind of the intellect and like the means ends reasoning to be like, well, how do I actually prevent this? Um,
Right.
and so in a sense they're more attuned to the world. Um, Rather than normal people they must construct a model of the world where it's almost not real, like they're not fully comprehending what this means.
Yes. It takes something to really, this combination of saying there's both a willingness to kind of look it in the face and to really, just in the way of taking an argument to a logical conclusion, really face up to the implications of this point about existential risk, about AI, because there's a kind of hope in the background. It's like we also maybe see a way, there's also a way that we could address these existential risks, potentially, at least to machine intelligence. That's what I'm hearing here.
Yes, yeah.
It's a community which was willing to look these in the face, and partly because they also saw perhaps there was things they could do about it.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I mean, so that's also like a core tenet of effective altruism, uh which is neglectedness. So issues that other people aren't paying attention to have like a lot of low-hanging fruit. And so if we could just commit like some resources to them, we could make a lot of progress very quickly. And so in relation to existential risk, it was just noticed that like um I can't remember exactly the details, but it might be that like there was a kind of nuclear disarmament organization, and they had like less funding than the average McDonald's. There was some kind of case like this that was kind of popularized within.
Yes.
And so they were like, well, like one of the first things we could do to try and mitigate existential risk is just like increase the funding of organizations like that. Because it seems like a massive misallocation of resources and like a lack of global priorities that we don't have like really highly funded um like research and strategic organizations oriented around this goal. And so this is in part in relation to that there's a like a collective action problem and a public goods um, underfunding from having
Yeah.
a world system of nation states and markets that there's a free rider problem where it's like um, if you allocate resources to mitigating existential risk, then you're not allocating those resources to like boosting economic growth. And so it's like a cost. Uh, so
Yes.
you may as well let other people fund mitigating existential risk. Um,
Exactly. I mean, I just want to add though, there's something specific about it because obviously, even like doing stuff about global poverty relates basically to collective action problems or externalities, for example. But there's something about the abstraction of existential risk and and also just being able to like look it in the face. This kind of was kind of a positive and unusual thing about effective altruism as a community, which is this, is full of quite let's say it is quite a rashness. I'm I was drawn to economics, and I'm also a computer programmer, and I would say that my experience of the EA exponential, so the effective altruism community is that there's quite a weighting of people who are quite, let's say, left brain. They're into finance, they're into engineering, they're into computer science, and so there's this other combination. But I think it's kind of also a valuable trait of looking at things in a bit more abstractly, which allows you to see patterns that you might otherwise miss. I just emphasize that because the same collective action point would make sense in other areas, but it's somehow this is particularly neglected existential risk because of its, I think, abstract nature. It's quite distant, it's very low probability, but has this massive outsized impact. Like we might all not be here.
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, just to mention that. And it is very economicsy. I mean, the thing is, I was someone in the late 90s even who was reading books about societal collapse. I read a book which is now quite mainstream, but which was it was basically almost out of print, Joseph Tainter's book on the collapse of complex societies. I was reading about like how many people can the Earth support, trying to do calculations about what Earth carrying capacity was. And this stuff would, thinking about these kind of things. But I noticed that was not common, and the fact that I ended up being an economist is not a coincidence, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So there does seem to be a unique, like, psychological and like cognitive
profile.
Yeah.
So the thing is that there's basically, so let's just say, so for people not familiar, we get into AI risk, we get into the risk of, bad superintelligence, whether like actually either used by bad actors, it is actually nefarious, or, as in the kind of Matrix, Terminator model, or even just like misdirected. Like it's the paperclip story of like the factory that manufactures paperclips that's, happens to be optimizing for making paperclips. It's not intending to cause harm, but ends up realizing, oh, I can make even more paperclips if I kind of use all of the Earth's resources, including all humans, to make paperclips. Yeah, so I mean, one thing that's odd here that I was obviously existential risk from AI was kind of prominent in popular culture. There were the Terminator movies. There were like, I think we could probably like need several hands to even name before the 2000s a future in which kind of robots go back. I think obviously this kind of, was it the right, what was it that had it take off in the 2000s? I guess it's the advance of machine intelligence to reaching a point where it was plausible these risks were proximate. What do you think was the cause there?
So I actually think this concern that the risks are proximate is much more recent, like since like ChatGPT was released. I think prior to that, this was like a very niche subculture that was kind of not
Right,
seriously. But I suppose
wait,
why
Max,
did what you're asking
Max,
is why?
I wouldn't say that. I would say that even by the late 2000s, there were people writing. I've forgotten the guy who's now even gone to Google, the famous futurist, was saying it was plausible at the rate of progress. Like it was only in the late 1990s that Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov at chess. There was a point in the 80s where, yeah, okay, computers are getting better and they're great, but there wasn't an ability to really project to the future. And even by the mid to late 2000s, it was getting plausible of like, well, we don't know where they're going to get to, but boy, if you extrapolate this continuing progress, things are going to shift. And it wasn't obviously 2016. I think it was 2016 was deep. AlphaGo, but long before ChatGPT, which was another layer of like acceleration, but long before that, my feeling was, and this was me, I wasn't deep in effective altruism, but I was starting to be, wow, if you just like logically think of where computers are going, that's going to happen. And that wasn't so clear in the 80s and 90s. When you weren't even around, but if you used computers then, there was not really an internet. Most people were not on the internet. Yes, you watched Terminator, but really, like things seem so far off. Whereas even by the late 2000s, it was kind of clear that things were at least continuing at a pace they were going at. Moore's law was continuing.
Yes, yeah. I think you're correct. Yeah, I think then it was the like timelines was that it would be somewhere in the late 21st century.
Century. Yes.
That's when we'd be developing AGI. Um, and then that was taken more seriously by the by technologists, and like by it got attention in the mainstream and wasn't kind of outright dismissed as
Yes.
a sci-fi scenario. There was still some of that, but yeah. So like,
What I meant for people like Eliezer Yudkowsky,
hmm,
for people in maybe quite a niche, it became much more plausible and real that this was a thing to think about now.
yeah, yeah,
That's what I'm getting at. Not that it was a mainstream concern at that point.
yeah, 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 and I think even then there was still a sense of urgency, because there was this recognition that the alignment problem, like how do we create AI systems that will adhere to human values, was just seen as this like impossible task. And so we need to get ahead of the curve here and try and solve this theoretically before we have the technical capabilities to actually build powerful AI systems. And so, yeah, I think that's also why it was like a major concern, even when the timelines seemed like, oh, we've got 100 years. Well, it's like maybe it will take 100 years to to figure this out.
And so so just to talk about, like, we've kind of done all this to explain effective altruism, to give several illustrations of how this combination of interest in doing good combined with um, a kind of rationalist empirical economicsy utilitarian, this kind of combination of philosophies that are actually kind of, I would say, come together most thoroughly in economics, a combination of utilitarianism and a kind of empirical rational structure for evaluating projects. Although it has a lot of also philosophical stuff from elsewhere, and I'm not saying it's really influenced by economics, but what I'm trying to say is this is, you can see how this plays out now. We can see how this kind of way of thinking leads to certain foci within the effective altruism movement, like a cause prioritization, as it's called, I think, within effective altruism.
Yes, yeah.
And so, just to say, there's been around global poverty, there's been around existential risk, particularly AI risk, and then also there's also things like animal welfare, reducing suffering of animals, which is an interesting one as well, I think, because it includes animals in the moral circle. It thinks of them as suffering from kind of pain, I guess, at least more in the material sense, because we can see the brains are similar. They're doing the kind of things that our brains do when we experience pain. But are there any, like, I don't know if there's any other major cause areas that we want to mention, or maybe the state, and then we might want to come to kind of the state of effective altruism today. But are there any other major cause areas of the 2010s, which is really when effective altruism took off, right? I mean, the Center for Effective Altruism is founded in, I think, 2010, 2011, is that right? Or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Give Well, which is one of the first organizations, is 2007, I think, founding. The first global conference is like 2013 or 2012 or something like that. And then it grew, and particularly like Dustin Moskovitz, the co-founder of Facebook, starts Open Philanthropy, influenced by Give Well and by this idea of doing good rationally, and starts flowing quite a lot of money into effective altruism from the early 2010s, really.
Mm.
And so I guess I mean, for example, just me, as I said, I was an effective altruist. I did a project like Give Well, but I'd never heard of it until about 2016, 2017, when I hired someone and they from Oxford, and they were really into this. So it really started to flow through into the mainstream by the 2015, I'd say, onwards.
Hmm.
Would you say? I mean, is that the movement better? But
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. I suppose I think I mainly got involved around like 2020.
yes, that's you. But I'm just saying. So, what I'm saying is, by then it's quite well known. Like, there are many chapters at universities. There's big global conferences. There, quite. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars billions of dollars are potentially flowing into this area, all the areas prioritized by it. It's got thought leaders and in faculty positions at universities. It's become really quite influential.
Yeah, and like Peter Singer and William McCaskill both published books that were like introducing effective altruism to the world around like 2015. Um,
Right, exactly. I read William McCaskill's book, which reminded me of my own reading. It's funny again, like 1990s, about like just hey, this was seemed to me quite old stuff. I'll come to that. I was a bit surprised that it was seen as novel, but like the fact that that most political and social systems were quite irrational was very obvious to me at that point. But the question, I guess, is that why? But what we're saying is that these books get published. It's starting to be quite mainstream, and what like where is effective altruism today? Well, no, obviously not everyone's heard of it. It's pretty, as I said, quite influential socially, and economically to some extent. I think the other thing I'd say is it seemed, you mentioned this coincidence with like capitalism, like, oh, guess what, it happens to say the same things as capitalism. One of the other things was that the effective altruism mindset really chimed with two very kind of ideologically and economically dominant forces of late modernity, which are financial capitalism, investors, Wall Street. Many effective altruists actually went to work for reasons of wanting to maximize money, but like went to work in, Wall Street firms, and the kind of mentality of investment of it's not a coincidence that the starters of GiveWell worked at a hedge fund. It's like we want to optimize the best things to invest in for good is like quite similar to like what we want to invest in to maximize our returns. And the coincidence with the engineering mindset of the IT industry, of the information technology industry, of the software and hardware industries, which are, economically and socially dominant in our societies in the West today. There's a kind of sociological and ideological coincidence. A/B testing in software is randomized controlled trials made mainstream. Is there anything you noticed about that kind of coincidence of our social and political power today and the rise of effective altruism?
Yeah. I mean, so what you're doing here is very much like Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, but we're doing it for effective altruism. That it is an historically contingent movement. So it's situated within the context of techno-capitalism, and it seems to have inherited the same methodologies and worldviews. And so, like, there are two terms here. One is philanthrocapitalism, and another from Fisher is business ontology. That now there's this sense that the market, we should apply the same techniques and ways of thinking to the rest of life. And so, like, really making so just the term like effective altruism, that there's an emphasis on efficiency and like not wasting resources. So this is how businesses operate. They try and reduce their costs and will like reduce their if there are any workers that aren't very effective, they'll like let them go. And so there's this streamlining. And so EA was trying to do the same thing with charities. Like, how do we make them as effective as possible? Yeah, and then it's also like intimately tied to capital accumulation in that in the early, like the first wave of EA, there was this emphasis on earning to give, and this was promoted in the media as kind of this provocative, shocking prescription that traditionally, when you think about people that are altruistically motivated, they might be quite ascetic and they'll give up all their possessions. Whereas the effective altruist was someone who would go and work at a hedge fund and like maximize how much money they could make and then redirect it towards philanthropic causes. And so it was kind of against the traditional aesthetic of what it meant to be an altruist, like from a kind of monk to like a businessman in a suit. Um, uh,
And that this is so brilliant about. I mean, I just want to make one thing. I remember going to a conference. We were funded by a Midjo network, and Reid Hoffman, who's the founder of LinkedIn, um, was invited to give the kind of a keynote to us all in our nonprofits. And his book, which we got given in our like hotel rooms, was called The Startup of You. So this idea of applying all of these kind of businesses approaches, in this case, to even your like own personal life and self-development, you know, like A/B test your life, you know, what would you invest in, you know, all of these kind of ideas applied to my own personal life, you know, not just even charities. So I think this point, there's something kind of very also fascinating. This is a almost different topic about the way effective altruism is almost like, because of its kind of positive intent, but it's kind of a representative of how the business ontology, the ideology of business and techno-capitalism has kind of infected, I'm using that term, but or pervaded is maybe more neutral, our entire like worldview, our entire way of operating and being in the world.
So the critical theorists, they talk of the market colonizing the life world, and I think
Yes.
that's what's happened. And so yeah,
and just an example, we just got to mention the ways this goes wrong, just so for people like ourselves listening. I mean, the famous one is obviously Sam Bankman-Fried, who ends up running this kind of basically sort of kind of Ponzi scheme, or like engages in basically securities fraud and various things around, and also many effective ads in crypto. Many of them get into crypto, which is a very Wild West area. And because of this logic of like, we just want to like make as much money to do as much good as we can. So Sam Bankman-Fried makes all this money, is actually giving a large amount of it to effective altruism, is a full hardcore effective altruist, is hiring other effective altruists, you know, has William McGaskill on board and so on. And then there's obviously this incredibly embarrassing blow up where this aspect of like, you know, this encouragement to make as much money as you can, to do as much good as you can, is kind of justifying fraud and greed, and like living in the Bahamas in this penthouse and, you know, hobnobbing with the rich and famous. It's kind of the classic reason that this is corrupting, why that this is dangerous to think this way, that the means justify the ends.
yeah. So there is this approach in effective altruism, which is very influenced by Plato, which is like there's this phrase from Plato that until philosophers become kings, or until kings become philosophers, like we won't be able to live the good life and have a functioning society.
Yeah.
And so there is this like linking of like the power elite with the with effective altruism, and there's a kind of reciprocal relationship. So it's that the EAs get access to resources and influence to do good, and then the kind of power elite, they get to have this like more moralistic
Legitimation, you know,
yes,
it's okay that you've made all this money because actually that's the way to do the most good, and you're contributing to economic growth. You know, you're Bill Gates and Windows versus Linux. You know, you've done the most good. You know, it's legitimated at several levels.
yeah,
Yes.
yes. And
And
this like core neoliberal ideology that justifies it in inequality, that like we shouldn't redistribute wealth because having billionaires means that we can do like big philanthropic funding, and that will actually alleviate the harms that inequality causes.
yes, it's actually far more important than the inequality. By the way, this goes way back into Chicago School in the 70s, this
Yeah.
kind of argument. And so the thing is that but I'm particularly saying the sociological enablement. Maybe it's the cause the other way, that the fact that it happens to be coincident with the power structures. I mean, like the fact that this thought of like even like randomized controlled trials, it's very aligned with the people who have resources today, which are, you know, doing A/B testing in their software startups. So there's this kind of really coincident at a deep ideological level, even beyond the coincidence of justifying your wealth, but just at the level of like how we even think about problems, like being efficient, testing two alternatives against each other, and so on, are very, there's this kind of synergistic element.
Mm.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's kind of come, and we're getting towards the end of, I think, this session, is that what we said at the beginning, we want to introduce, like, what we want to start thinking about, okay, what are the limitations of EA or the challenges of EA, and why this might be why therefore you might be interested in like an evolution of effective altruism towards what we term pragmatic utopianism. And you know, I think one thing you pointed out that's very useful is to say embedded in actually effective altruism are also, as we said, there's lots of really wonderful things. I mean, it's good to use reason. We, for example, at least I'm saying, we're not wanting to throw out reason. We want to use reason and empirics, but we don't want to be reducible to it. There are many things we cannot A/B test. Now, that doesn't mean we cannot use reason about them or empirics to some extent, but we cannot limit ourselves to things where we can do, like, you know, what I would call almost scientistic approach of like randomized controlled trials. We do not have a planet B where we can run large-scale civilizational alternatives in many cases. But the point here is I'm trying to say is there is also a utopian element of effective altruism. It is actually in, you know, even in the Bostrom fantasies, which can seem a bit disturbing, of like, let's all upload ourselves to you know, the machines and, you know, colonize the light cone. There's a vision of a dream, whether it's a dream that's maybe even disturbing. I would say some people it would be dystopian, but there is a dream of utopia, of something a radically better future. Maybe it's a future where you just can have, you know, machine orgasms all the time, you know, to stimulate your brain. I mean, I mentioned this because Bostrom talks about this, but there is an aspect of utopianism in effective altruism, which again, I think one wants to build on. And I think that one of the things we have lost in modern times and in actually capitalism and neoliberal capitalism is we've lost our ability to dream of like radically better futures. We've become kind of resigned to what I call the iPhone upgrade version of society. Like, we can have a little bit bigger screen, it'll be a little bit better, and the screen will get better each time, but it's nothing radically different. We couldn't imagine a world where we're really profoundly happy a lot of the time, where, you know, there is no war, there is no poverty, you know, and so on. The best we can imagine is, you know, Star Wars. We've got much, much better technology, but we're still fighting each other, you know, millions of years in the future. You know, Darth Vader does not get therapy, he gets a lightsaber. But what I want to emphasize is embedded in effective altruism are utopian aspirations, ultimately, I think, beyond the narrow rationalism is a commitment to curiosity, open-mindedness, epistemic humility, which means that there's a lot of space to expand. And I would say, you know, expand from like rationality towards what I would call wisdom, you know, from rationality to wisdom, and to pragmatism. You know, I would say sometimes the term, you know, pragmatism in maybe even the strict sense of pragmatic philosophy, Charles Sanders Peirce and so on in the late 19th century. So do you want to say, like, maybe we just put the end of saying, like, some of the challenges that effective altruism is facing at the present time? One, I mean, I'd say one is this kind of deep questioning of like the instrumentalism that often is one of the classic critiques of utilitarianism, the Sam Bankman-Fried logic of like, it doesn't matter if I'm committing fraud, if I'm doing enough good with my money. That seems kind of disturbing at a kind of an ethical level. And obviously many effective altruists would completely reject that. Of course they would. Nevertheless, it is an existence proof of the risk of that like earn to do good, like earn to give mentality, which is, well, what is the impact of Wall Street capitalism on the world? You know, and similarly, and the other one is obviously an existential risk. There's been a growing understanding that engineering type approaches solving the control problem are either impossible or so unlikely on the timescale we might be talking as to be kind of irrelevant, and that other approaches which involve kind of global governance, solving collective action problems at real scale, governing tech are more important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, do you want to say a bit more about what you see as like the kind of rising challenges for it at the moment?
Yeah, so the timelines on AI has meant that the effective altruism movement has collapsed into an AI alignment movement. So there are two strands here. One is technical AI safety, and the other is AI governance or like policy. And this is so, for instance, 80,000 Hours, that are the main EA career guidance organization, they've overtly shifted focus to doing AI exclusively. Like they'll refer other people to other organizations that want to do like animal welfare or global poverty. So this is the third wave of effective altruism, this radical shift to like AI is all that matters. And we just have to move as fast as possible to get the regulation in place and the like international agreements, and then also to get as many like talented computer scientists and AI researchers into the main labs. And so that's the shift.
And just to mention other examples of that, like in Open Philanthropy, I've forgotten, I can't pronounce his name, but the main CEO kind of has stopped being CEO to just entirely focus on AI risk.
Holden Karnofsky.
Yeah, Harlan Karnofsky, who again was very influential, founded GiveWell, CEO of Open Philanthropy. So this kind of this evidence, this focus of basically in third wave, of this kind of narrowing down on AI risk, and where most of the funding is now going.
Yes, yeah.
And this is both an opening, this is both an opportunity for pragmatic utopianism, because it confronts the community with the basically safety, the classic idea of AI safety, which is will work on alignment, is basically hopeless potentially, or hopeless without some slowdown.
Yeah, so there's been a shift recently to this sub-area of AI control is tacitly admitting that we can't solve alignment, so we just have to like limit the area of effect and try and contain AI systems. So if they are misaligned, it doesn't actually have real world consequences. So like one approach to this is to do like a radical task decomposition or division of labor, so that you have many AI systems as part of like a massive structure and process, and they don't have like a wider contextual awareness of what it is they're doing. And so they're kind of like operating on a need to know basis. And so no single AI system has like control and influence over the whole.
But what's bizarre about all of this is that Bostrom, who's one of the godfathers of this area, his book Superintelligence sets out argument after argument about why that's likely to fail.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
And it's also why Eliezer Yudkowsky is a full-on like halter now, right? If I understand correctly.
Yes, yeah, yeah. So he wrote this piece
In
saying
time.
shut it down. Yeah. And so yeah, like he's admitting that we can't do AI safety effectively given the short timelines. So we just have to stop it. And but then like if you were to try and prompt him, well, how do we do this? Like he would say, well, it's also politically intractable, that there is this like
Yes, there's a resignation.
and collective. Yeah. So now I think like the most recent thing I've seen from him is like he's proposed super babies and like cyborgism as a solution, that we can enhance the intelligence of humans and integrate humans with AI, and that's how we can kind of keep up with super intelligence. And so again, this is exhibiting a kind of techno solutionism.
Yes.
But it's just moving it from the AI systems to like humans. Yeah, so essentially, like the approach now is the techno solutionism of trying to solve control, and then the political solutionism of trying to get in governance arrangements that can manage AI development. And
Now, this brings us to certain things that are very intriguing about AI. About effective altruism in general, and obviously the kind of soft underbelly of the critique, which I would say are two two things that I encountered, and in the piece that I can send you, which I wrote back in 2017 when I first met, which is, I don't know, and I'd love to hear your views, Max, but I see the critique of effective altruism, which came out of my experience of being, I would say, an effective altruist and an economist, practically implement, trying to practically do things in the 2000s, actually, do good better in society and do policy work, was one is what I call the drunk in the lamppost problem, and also the aspect of overestimating precision. So one is that the drunk in the lamppost story, I think everyone will familiar, but is that you meet a man on the street who's a bit worse for wear from the drink one night, and he's searching under a lamppost with the light, and you ask him what is he doing. He said, "Oh, I lost my keys." And you're like, "Okay," and you start searching with him on the ground. After about 5 minutes, you're like, "I really don't see them here." And he's like, and you say to him, "Where did you lose your keys?" And he says, "Oh," points back up the street 20, 30 meters. Said, "Well, up there." And you're like, "Well, why are we looking here?" And he said, "Well, there's light here." So there's this aspect where we tend to focus our energies where there's light, even if it's actually not relevant to the problem. And this applies in this case, which is if you're interested in things that you can rationally evaluate for their impact, you can do randomized controls trials on, for example. This obviously limits you greatly in the kind of issues that you can look at. There are just certain things, for example, a lot of things of trying to improve governance actually in society. It's very difficult. They take decades to affect and so on, or existential risk. So there's this aspect where once we focus on certain kind of problems or certain kind of methodologies, we exclude many other approaches. And the other aspect of that is false precision. So I think this is one of the interesting things that I've wondered about EA, which I've always asked them, because it came up for me in economics, which was, how do you determine where to put your effort? How do you do these calculations of, okay, the payoff of working on existential risk on AI is, more important than working on animal welfare, or, some things it seems like an easy slam dunk, right? That um, that some areas it seems like a bit of a slam dunk that you can uh, you can uh, spending money on a kind of pediatric cancer ward versus bed nets is easy. But a lot of the more interesting things, how do you know that AI risk is more important than stopping asteroids or than dealing with climate change? It seems really, really challenging to determine this, right?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and I think as well there's a real like force function of cause prioritization that as soon as you say like AI risk is where we should allocate all our resources, including like human capital, um, then it's trying to just funnel everything into that. And it fails to account for the fact that um, there is there are many like intelligent, altruistic individuals and like philanthropists that just won't buy AI risk, but they're like very into environmentalism and the climate. So instead of viewing it as like adversarial, that it's either AI risk or nothing, it's like we can just strategically um, uh, like have an expanded conception of like having multiple causes operating in synergy. And this is also like just quite a kind of obvious thing to do when you think about how the different risks will like interact. Um, so like for instance, there's been some criticism that like AI development is like very energy intensive and is like externalizing harm to the environment. Um, and so like a lot of environmentalists will be like against AI development, but not because it could be misaligned and kill everyone, but because it's going to cause like climate risk. So you can build like coalitions where people have like different motivations, but have the same strategic objective. Um, and so I'm not sure like how much this is being done by like pause AI or other kind of AI advocacy movements.
I want to come. So I want to come to this two. One critique is there's this kind of, I would say, narrow rationalism that can lead to like versus, and I'll come to what we could say is a replacement, like a wisdom. But basically, so the issue this has is it narrows what you focus on. You only look under the lamppost, and I would say it leads to also a misplaced faith in numbers. You know, this tendency to overvalue quantitative things and be a bit like, oh, you know, there's a 1 in 6 probability of AI extinction, whereas it's only 1 in 20 from asteroids or whatever the calculation would be. And there tends to be kind of a tendency to kind of like place too much trust in those kind of calculations versus like intuition or other things that might help us deal with a world which is combinatorially explosive in its complexity. But the other critique, which that's one arm of it. I think the other arm, which came from my experience as an economist, which is really what struck me, was the implementation problem. So what I started to see was that on most of the things that I was interested in, you know, as an economist, most of the areas I worked in, what actually got in the way of implementing the desired outcome, where there would often be like overwhelming rational evidence or you know overwhelming empirical evidence in many ways that it was the thing to do, was that it turned out that most of the time what got implemented in this world had little to do with that. There were collective action problems. People were deluded ideologically or for other reasons. And so one of the other critique is like, even if you know what to do, it turns out that most of your problem isn't a coordination problem, which is made worse by the fact that people are not very rational in many ways. So I guess the other critique was what I would call the political realism point, which is knowing what to do is actually really quite a minor problem. What's really most important is aligning people. Now, I get that the effective altruism movement has actually been quite effective at aligning people within effective altruism.
Yeah.
But as they're discovering, like, for example, on AI risk, you actually need to solve a global governance problem. And that a lot of the issues that we face, climate crisis, most catastrophic risk, in fact, ultimately require global coordinated action. And that was the other big critique that I had, which was that, like, actually you need politics. And, the crudest story of it was like, my dad's a really smart guy. He seems pretty rational. He's intellectual, intelligent. And yet I didn't change his mind about very much. And I also need to change lots of my people like my dad's mind to do a lot of things. So the question, I guess, that came to me is that I started to be interested when I was an economist is like, how do people make up their minds? How do they change their minds? And how do we coordinate groups at some degree of scale? How do you solve collective action problems at potentially global scale, or even let alone national scale? Or even just national scale. So I think these were the kind of critiques that what I think is good is that the existential risk AI community are starting to be very confronted. Now, one approach to that is like Eliezer, is that you can kind of give up. You can go back into your techno-solutionism because you're so resigned about solving collective action problems. But my answer to that would be that is exactly the drunker in the lamppost. It's like, oh, I know I need to solve this thing over there, but I think it's impossible, so I'm just going to search under the lamppost over here, even though it won't really solve our problem.
Yeah.
I think in a moment, by the way, we should wrap this one up.
Yes,
but just
yeah.
what would you like to say?
Yeah. So like the logic with AI is that, oh, if I don't develop it, someone else will. And
the race to the bottom.
yeah, there's this narrative that like no one actually wants to like develop AI super fast, but we're having to do it because we're in this trap with like China or just our like competitors in the market. And so like we would do the safety measures if that wasn't the case. So this is the kind of like the Moloch trap of like, oh, like we don't want this bad thing to happen, and it turns out no one else does too, but it happens nonetheless, and it's because Moloch is doing it. Now I think this is like just pure alienation, and it's very like it's under the guise of realism, but it actually reveals that realism is constructed, that you're constructing this abstract adversary that is like racing to the bottom, and therefore you have to do that too. So it's kind of a psychological trick that AI developers are playing on themselves. And also, it's a sleight of hand because a lot of them do want to develop it as fast as possible, um,
Yes.
for the status, for this techno-utopian vision of like solving all diseases, and achieving immortality and colonizing the stars. So there are kind of multiple branches where the ideology forks.
What we need to do next, and next is how there's a way forward.
Yes, yeah.
Both there is a way forward that we can solve, and approach that's being used won't work. We don't. We both need like hope and a convincing point that the current system, like, and that leads us to the kind of cultural evolution, cultural utopianism.
Yes, that's for next time.
Okay, till next time.